I definitely think that the sort of layoffs and the general climate has impacted employee psyche to finally do that important work of separating that company that I've given 15 years to is actually not my family, right? Like they are not my family. They're not, their best interest is not my health and longevity here. And that's a very healthy emotional separation. So I think that's part one. I think part two is there's this moment of how can I diversify the ways in which I apply my skills and the formats in which I deliver my skills such that I have more options available. That intersects then with other life priorities, right? And so as women and men, by the way, are thinking, how can, like the demands on my time are getting more at home. The security in the workforce is getting shakier. How can I create this bucket of opportunities and ways in which I can lend my skills and talent that are able to give me more security and help me take care of what I need to take care of in my personal life. And so there's sort of a collision of both of those things, right? Because it's not happening in a vacuum.
Welcome to Leadership on New Terms, a show with the leaders renegotiating the terms of work as AI rewrites the work itself. I'm Caroline Fairchild, and I'm so excited to be here with Neha Ruch. She is the founder and author of The Power Pause. It's a platform, a movement, and a book redefining career breaks for ambitious women. Neha, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I've really been looking forward to this conversation. Honestly, since before I met you, before when I actually read the book, I was like, I have to speak with this woman. And in my eyes, Power Pause was really just like this overnight success. I remember when the book came out and seeing you on CBS This Morning and thinking, wow, this woman really nailed it. But you spent close to 10 years building. When people meet you now and they see the book and the platform and the success, what do they really miss about that 10 years before?
I once heard Adriana Karig, I don't know if you know her, she's the founder of Little Words Project, and she talked about Little Words Project as being a 10-year overnight success, right? And I so resonated with that because I think the biggest thing missing in this overnight success story is the years where it was, you know, really planting seeds for it alongside my own power pause or alongside my own career break for family life, where it really was done in the fringe hours of family life and during naps and night times. And a lot of people didn't get it. And a lot of people, you know, thought, well, this looks like a cute, small project. And so, you know, I think when women and men step into entrepreneurship, often there's this hope that it's going to be instant validation or instant money. And I got neither of those for a long period of time. And I hope that people understand that so much of the foundation of this work was having to live through the misunderstanding and the tension around the distance between how I felt and how the world perceived me, and not just in my career break, but in the work I was doing.
Right, the work being kind of charting your own path and doing something different.
And really, you know, using this time away from the traditional workforce to shape something of interest, but do it in a way that, you know, might not have looked big on the outside, but felt really big and important to me. And, you know, one of the things I feel most proud about is that even though it took 10 years and even though it took on different shapes and certainly grew in the last, you know, 3 to 4 years, if you look at the first email I sent, it's the exact same mission. And so the idea at its core stayed the same, even if I had different capacity to build on it. And by the way, culture was at a very different point when it started to ramp up.
And you said something on our call that I keep thinking about, which is when you're building something, you want one of two things, right? You either want money or validation. And like you just said, you just get none of that in the beginning. How did you keep going through that?
So the beginnings of this work were really at a moment where I had taken my foot off the gas. I had chosen to downshift my career. I was, you know, prior to that, I'd spent 10 years in brand marketing. I'd gone to business school. I had what on paper was my dream job. And then suddenly I wanted more time with my kid, and I started hearing all of this, you know, I think it came from a place of true concern, but like true confusion around my choices. And as we know, it's very hard to separate our own self-worth from what people think. And that was practice that I was working through. But meanwhile, I was meeting all these incredible women who, similar to me, had clocked in 10 to 15 years in their career, had really hands-on partners, and were not sort of martyring themselves to motherhood, but were genuinely interested in, wow, if I slow down to make room for this new thing, what might it uncover? And so what kept me going was that I knew I wanted to start a project that explored my reality. I wanted a new representation of modern women who were choosing to take a downshift or a pause. I knew there was that white space in the market at the time. So I felt very clear on the what is this going to be? And also I got really clear on what does success look like for this year, because no one was going to tell, and I took it 1 year at a time. And I wrote about how important it is to have success metrics that aren't salary or title when you're in this sort of vast in between, right? And I talked about the success metrics in 2017 as being network, impact, and learning. And so for me, that was all it was in the beginning. It was, if I can, see this conversation through and reach a handful of women and make a difference in their lives because they feel seen, and I will feel better for surrounding myself with interesting women, then amazing. If I can expand my network and meet interesting people through it while I'm currently at home, that gives me a sense of connectedness that I really want.
That shift from thinking about careers and power from salary and title to network, impact, and learning, that's really a shift from thinking about positional power versus structural power. Why do you think it's so challenging for not just women, but for workers in general to make that leap in their minds about how they're defining success in their own terms in their career?
I think it's twofold, right? We enter the workforce into typically a traditional environment, and we get an annual review at the end of every year. And that annual review charts a very clear linear path for what success is. And oftentimes it's measurable. And oftentimes it's associated with money, right? Like you brought in this much deal, you created this much reputational growth. And when it spelled out that way for us internally within organizations, but also externally within dialogue around corporations and organizational success, then we internalize that being the way in which we can measure our own growth and forward motion. A lot of the reason I centered the sort of middle section around the book, around how do you redefine what your own growth is because in the absence of goals being handed to you, right, by an employer, you are left to your own devices in having to say, well, what are goals truly? What would success at the end of this year look like? And if we've internalized for, a decade plus, if not before that in high school, as we're watching what, our grown-ups talk about success, if we've internalized that success is tied to salary, then in the absence of that, we have to go back to the drawing board. And the reason I centered that sort of middle section on that was I wanted a blueprint to make myself feel like I was moving forward, because goals dignify our time. Goals help us feel like, oh, I'm moving from point A to point B. And it's very common where you hear women, as soon as they part from the traditional workforce, saying, I feel stuck. And that stuckness comes from, no one's telling me if I'm moving forward. And that can be so intimidating until you realize it can actually be this incredibly eye-opening way of really putting pen to paper on what true success looks like. One incredibly powerful thing I did was I literally wrote in a Google Doc what my ideal day in 5 years was going to look like. And by the way, if the 5 years feels like too big of a scope because you have a 3 and 1 year old, write it in a day. And when you write that ideal day, you can write it in great detail, how, what space you're working out of, who you're spending time with, what time you're waking up, how you feel in your body, how you feel in your mind, what you're spending your time on, not because that's suddenly what you need to work toward for next year, but because when you read it through over and over, it'll start to reveal the true authentic goals, right? You might say, wow, I feel really strong in that version. And there's a lot of wellness in this. And maybe a personal goal of mine is to commit more time, an hour a day, to feeling stronger. Or maybe professionally, I'm actually working on a portfolio of work and I spend my day, 30% thought leadership, 30% consulting, and 30% volunteerism. And suddenly you have this sort of germ of I can sort of peel that back and say, maybe my measurable metric is I take on one volunteering engagement this year and I start to meet with 5 different women by the end of the year to shape my consulting offering, right? So you start to take those big goals that are revealed in your ideal day and then draw out of them really measurable pieces that move you closer towards the ideal.
And what you're talking about is so necessary because of just the conditioning of the traditional workplace of what your goals should be or what should give you purpose in your career. But I want to go back to this idea that it doesn't happen overnight because I think it's an important message for folks who are out there. So stayed at Zola actually in what now would be called kind of like a fractional head of brand. Fractional I don't think was really a big thing back then, but you were 2 days a week in the office. Walk us back to that micro decision that you made and kind of the in-between of, oh, I'm in the traditional environment, but I'm also building something. And then when did you know it was the time to walk away from Zola entirely?
So I left business school. I went to Zola as their head of brand, but I was full-time.
Okay.
And then a partner offered me a fractional role. And so I actually went to that partner who was also in the wedding tech space and was there initially for more time. And then after having my son 2 days a week. So I downshifted after having my son. And when I think back on that sort of micro decision, it was, now I can sort of wrap the layers around it. But I'll tell you, it was a way in which to dip my toe and test. And I encourage women all the time. There are so many shades of gray between the black and white ideas of stay at home and working. And I knew I wanted to stay connected to the professional workspace. I knew I wanted to stay connected to income at that moment in time. And so what it did when I initially decided to go 2 days a week was it gave me a chance to test, would I actually like those days at home with my son? Who knows? Like a lot of people don't. And I really didn't know if I was going to be able to structure that day to day in a way that felt fulfilling. So it gave me time to trial that. It gave my husband and I about 2 years to be able to test what our household income felt like and our lifestyle felt like with a salary that was about at 60% at that time. So it gave us sort of that financial runway to be able to make a really informed decision. I think it also let me see if what I was optimizing for in terms of flexibility. And I say that because I think flexibility now, we sort of assign it as like a global descriptor, but it means so many things to different people. And I knew I wanted room for motherhood. I knew I wanted room for myself to sort of get comfortable in this day-to-day of motherhood, sink into it, see what it unlocked for me, see what else existed out there. But I also wasn't certain how much time. And I think what that fractional opportunity, at the time it was just called part-time, allowed was me to see, well, is it 2 days? Is it 2 days in the office? Like, is that a nice rhythm? And it really was for a couple of years. And then I had my second daughter. And it stopped feeling good. It started feeling incredibly, incredibly stressful. I had a very different experience between my first birth and my second birth. I had a very different postpartum experience with my first child and my second child. And I had a lot of postpartum anxiety that was really centered on how much time I was spending with each child. That was sort of my focus. And I would sort of count it down to the minutes, count it down to the hours. And suddenly the time that had felt really luxurious, having 2 days in an office and 3 days of the week with my child, no longer felt that way. It felt stressful. It felt like the financial input did not offset the stress in the home. We needed to bring in more help. So there was a number of different factors, but I think the biggest piece was I let myself test and learn. I was so glad I did. It put another option in the menu for me for when and if I returned to the workforce. And when the equation no longer felt healthy and stress-free as it was, I was able to recalibrate. And that's the piece I always talk to people about, is that you can always reevaluate, right? If you return to work full-time after maternity leave, why not talk to your manager about solutions in which to make that work better, right? Maybe it is that you need 1 day working remote, and maybe you pitch it as like a 6-month trial period. That way the employer and you can recalibrate and you have these checkpoints. I gave those checkpoints for myself, and I think those were helpful to come back and see, like, does this work? Is this still working? Is it not working?
So there's the internal framework and kind of the internal work you have to do to figure out what mix of work and life works for you and your family at any given season, and that shifts totally. I understand that and empathize with that entirely. But let's think about the external factors as well. So the power pause makes this financial case that the pause penalty is smaller than the gender penalty. But there is that penalty, right? And there's still that stigma that you are really leading the charge of changing and shifting within the workforce. Why does that distinction matter between the pause penalty, as you call it, and the gender penalty? And what does the data still not show that we need to know to really unpack this?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about what the data doesn't show. So the data that exists right now is a bit dated. And the reason I clarify in the financial chapter about the penalties, because for a long time we have said that women who take a career break make 79 cents to the dollar, right? And so that seems like pretty significant. And then, except the reality is, if you compare apples to apples, women who never took a career break are still making 83 cents to a dollar. You would know better than I, but there's still a gap, but it's not quite as significant. So we're up against sort of larger forces. And why did those pay penalties exist? Why do the systems not support women in general to thrive in the workforce? I think that's a big reason why women are taking career pauses, right? Because they were saying, if the system is already stacked against us and we're getting penalized anyways, why not be able to redesign work to work better for us? And I think where we've been as a culture, especially with feminism, has been, how can we prove our capacity in the workforce? And I think what we're all woken up to say, and what I propose in the book, is we all woke up and said, we proved our capacity in the workforce. We're incredible employees. And yet the system is not we had to do it by burying our needs. And sometimes those needs are lactation rooms. Sometimes those needs are like longer maternity leaves, because, by the way, we do actually have children and it does actually impact our body and we do actually need to heal. Sometimes those needs are taking career pauses or downshifts, and to allow ourselves room for the very real intellectual and emotional demands of caregiving. I think a lot of it accelerated, by the way, after the pandemic, a real wake up to something's not working. And maybe this is the time where we take on a new version of feminism, a next evolution, where we say, we still want to thrive in work and family, but we need more options. And we get more options by being honest about the reality of womanhood and that we are actually different. And so what is the research lacking? I think we have not updated the research in the last 5 years to account for when women return. What are the factors with which they rank of value? So I know in our research that we commissioned in 2023 with Proof Insights, we asked women returning from career pauses, what are your top 3 priorities when you return to the workforce? Number 1 was flexibility. Number 2 was less stress. Number 3 was salary, right? So our equation on how we're measuring our work has changed. Then longitudinally, we don't have any longitudinal research about how women's careers then progress over sort of 10 to 15 years, accounting for an access to stay connected, right? So many of the women who are on career pauses are still staying connected, whether that be through volunteerism, whether that be through upskilling, whether that be through advising other people's companies or consulting and freelance gig economy. So I think all of those factors I'd love to see measured as to how they impact sort of a woman's longitudinal career.
I mean, it was many years ago, gosh, probably 5 or 6, but a study that I ran when I was at LinkedIn was like something like 72% of women keep their toes in the professional waters while they're on a career break. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure that those numbers have only gone up. Yeah.
I think it's 90% aim to return to the workforce. And I think and by the way, the 90%, even that stat, is somewhat dated to 2016.
Well, Neha, speaking of the research, one of the areas that I'm really fascinated by is flexibility. Some see it as a panacea, others see it as, the end of women's careers. We've seen some notable books come out in the last couple months that make that claim. Where do you land? What does your spidey sense tell you in terms of how we should be viewing flexibility and its role, particularly for women who are in leadership positions and exercising it?
I love that you clarified leadership positions, because I think flexibility, I said this earlier, means something different to everyone. Flexibility, in the end, is deciding how you do your work the best while also maintaining other priorities in your life. There are some women who would say, success for me is singularly if you run three massive companies. And for that person, flexibility and prioritize, like, making room for other priorities, it looks very different than the person who says success for me is being able to practice my skill in radiology and do my part at the University of Virginia. I'm drawing on someone I got to meet on tour, and do that at 50% while also being able to be at home for 50% and enjoying those years and taking care of my elderly parents and dialing up or dialing down later on. So this goes back to the idea of no one's version of success is the same. And so I 100% applaud Emma Green for saying the honest truth, which is to get to her position, she would not advise someone to not get the FaceTime, the very valuable FaceTime in the office, right? If someone else were to say, but that is not success to me, I want very much to be able to do work of impact, but I also do want to be remote and be able to lessen the financial strain in our home and not have an after school sitter and be able to turn on again at 6 p.m. That's a different human being with a different definition of flexibility. And the best thing we can do as women is be honest about the choices and trade-offs so that we can put more empowered, informed options on the table.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people just saw the headlines and ran with them. So I appreciate you unpacking the nuance as well. And, I read the book. It was great and has such strong messages. What I'm curious about is how you actually think flexibility is going to impact women's representation. And so the concern I have is if workplaces don't shift in terms of how they are evaluating people, how they're perceiving folks who do exercise hybrid options, we're going to see a sliding of the numbers when it comes to women's representation. In fact, we're already kind of seeing that in early signs of the data.
Yeah. I think we're going to see an expansion of different types of leadership positions. So what I mean by that is, in tandem with the data that is shifting in the sort of traditional workforce, what we've seen is a boom of female entrepreneurs, right? We've seen women outpace men in starting businesses in the last few years. There's a reason for that, right? Because they are building companies that afford them the flexibility that they need or want and the ability to do work of meaning, to do profitable work on their own terms. So I think, we discount that sort of pool when we talk about representation, but I think that's a really important part of this. So one of the things I think I'm most excited about is not only are women founding businesses, but then they're hiring other women, mothers, into impactful roles within those organizations. And because they understand how much efficiency, how much leadership potential a mother has, because they've lived it and walked it, they are more likely to afford that fractional chief marketing officer the terms that make work better for her and make another leadership position work for her.
And I would argue also right now, one of the reasons why this new ecosystem is growing so much, yes, it's structural. Women want to set their own terms of work, as you just said, but I'm also seeing a lot of senior women rethink how they think about risk right now. It used to be that going out fractional or going out on a portfolio career was viewed as risky, having your eggs in so many baskets. But now, with AI and everything that we're seeing with layoffs and how employers are treating their talent in this period of change with technology, it kind of looks like putting everything into one employer while AI eats apart at our jobs is riskier than actually building a portfolio career. How are you seeing that shift and how are you thinking about that?
I definitely think that the sort of layoffs and the general climate has impacted employee psyche to finally do that important work of separating that company that I've given 15 years to is actually not my family, right? Like they are not my family. Their best interest is not my health and longevity here. And that's a very healthy emotional separation. So I think that's part one. I think part two is there's this moment of how can I diversify the ways in which I apply my skills and the formats in which I deliver my skills such that I have more options available. That intersects then with other life priorities, right? And so as women and men, by the way, are thinking, the demands on my time are getting more at home. The security in the workforce is getting shakier. How can I create this bucket of opportunities and ways in which I can lend my skills and talent that are able to give me more security and help me take care of what I need to take care of in my personal life. And so there's sort of a collision of both of those things, right? Because it's not happening in a vacuum. But then the flip side of that, the more positive side, is then we start seeing our mentors, right? People that we look up to in the workforce go out and talk about how they're doing this. And it starts modeling for us and shifting the stereotypes and stigmas that have prevented us from maybe taking that leap ourselves. So we're seeing more models for it. And I think that's the part that's exciting, is that as people start paving new paths for themselves, they're bringing other people with them, sometimes in the case of employing other people in supporting roles, or they're modeling for other people and creating a brain trust. That's the part that I'm most excited for among women, is how do we create a brain trust amongst ourselves such that because I've done it, now you can do it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's the modeling that is so important. Neha, as you know, everything is cyclical, though, in the job market. So right now we're seeing a lot of women take power pauses. I don't think that's cyclical. Hopefully that continues going on. We see a lot of women going out, starting on their own, building portfolio careers. I wonder, as you think back to these women, maybe they want to go back to traditional work at some point in their careers. If you could change one term of how the job market evaluates these women who have either stepped back or gone on a different path or some combination of the two, and now we're ready to come back in, what would you change in terms of how that woman is evaluated?
I think the singular piece would be reframing the idea of a resume gap as actually, whether you use power pause or career sabbatical, where they developed a huge, important repertoire of skills and non-traditional experiences that they layered on top of all of their prior experience, right? I think it's incredibly important to note that if you have put in 15 years in a traditional workforce, that job, that experience goes with you. It doesn't evaporate. And then when you're stepping into time away from the traditional workforce, the key is that women are actually making room for themselves to develop new interests and skills that widens their perspective, widens their network, and actually then sort of layers on top. And of course, I think a lot of that responsibility still hangs on the returner to be able to package that non-traditional experience in a way that is compelling and relatable. But my ask of employers, and I've met an incredible number of especially female hiring managers, but I'm increasingly meeting male hiring managers who are shifting that perception and are able to say, time away from the traditional workforce is becoming increasingly common. How might I be able to ask about the non-traditional experiences in a way that is constructive and can connect the dots to the future role?
Yeah, the number of women that I've spoken to just in the past 6 months who have said, my pause or my career transition, that moment that I had away from traditional work, was some of the most empowering, some of the most rewarding, but also some of the most developmental for me in terms of my career. I've learned so much, and I'm so glad that you took the time to be with us. Before I let you go, this is a question that I ask of every guest. What is one full-time term of your last role that you will just never accept again?
That my title is all that I am. I took a lot of time to develop a sense of who I was outside of being able to say I run brand at a tech company, right? And I think it has become a superpower to know I'm bigger than that.
Neha, this has been such a great conversation. For those who are listening, if you haven't picked up The Power Pause, it is a great read and you should pick it up. And Neha, I have to go back to what you said earlier. You said I might be a big part of this transition to how we think about pauses and career breaks. It's not a might. You were a big part of that transition, and I'm so thankful, and I know so many other women are thankful for the work that you've done.
Thank you for saying that, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, this is Leadership on New Terms. You can find us on LinkedIn, Substack, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm Caroline Fairchild, and I'll see you back here next week.